you for participating in Space Walk of Fame's Oral History program. If you would please state your full name and any nicknames that you might be known by as well before we begin.
Charles Bradley Mars, Charlie, and as George Page used to call a lot of people, God damn it, Charlie.
Before we begin with your actual time here in Florida and your affiliation with NASA, I'd like to back up just a little bit about your education and if you had any interest in missiles prior to your affiliation with the space program.
Graduated from Vanderbilt University in 1958 and stood at the grounds of the Joint University Library and watched Sputnik go overhead, so that was sort of my first real beginning of a passion as far as missiles were concerned. Worked for the Martin Company in Orlando for 4 years, 59 to 63 on Lacrosse, Pershing, Birdie, and Missile Master systems. So I was getting into pieces of the aerospace type industry, even though it was for the war type rockets. And used to live out in Windermere, Big Lake Butler, as a matter of fact. And me and my buddies would lay on the inner tubes and look out over the trees, and every now and then we could see these little missiles shooting up in the air. So that was another thing that was kind of drawing me away. And then a good friend of mine came over and worked for NASA in a Mercury program. In 1963, that's when I made my move, came in on the MA-9 Gordon Cooper flight for Mercury.
Now, when you acquire your job for the Martin Company, did they seek you out or did you answer an ad in a paper or a trade magazine?
I happened to be visiting my dad, who was had a company in Orlando, and my good friend here again, Bill Criddle, that I just mentioned a minute ago, was there, and he got me an interview.
What was your starting salary and title?
Starting salary was, I think, less than $100 a week. Wasn't very much. And I was a basically engineering aide. And you qualified for that by having a degree. I had the degree in electrical engineering. And then you put a year or two in as basically an apprentice before they'd make you a full-fledged engineer.
Were you married at the time?
No, I was fun and fancy free in Orlando for a good 2.5 years before I got married. And when I got married, I married a dental hygienist who was working in Orlando and in the Atlantic. And we moved to Indy Atlantic because that's where her job was. And then I commuted to the Cape, well over an hour's drive every day. A fellow named Bruce Laubenheimer and I used to make that trip.
You say that she worked in both Orlando and Indy Atlantic.
Mm-hmm.
Is that unusual?
It was at that time, yes. But she would put a couple of days in with a dentist in Orlando, and I'm not sure how she got in touch with the guy in Melbourne. But it was nice. We would spend weekends on the beach there around Indy Atlantic, and then come back home Sunday night so that I could go back to work at Martin.
When you're working for the Martin Company, there's a lot of shots going off over here. You're within a reasonable driving time. Did you come over here just to witness some shots from the beach?
Never did.
Never?
Never did. Don't know why I didn't come over. I think it was always there were at times that it just wasn't convenient for us to get over here.
So when you are with the Martin Company and you start with NASA, was there a reduction in your salary or anything, or did you make more money for NASA?
I think I came over and lost, as I recall, it was $5 or $6 a week to come to work for NASA, and that was I was one of the lucky ones, because most of the guys coming over would lose more than that. But I was kind of at the edge of, starting to make a little bit more money with Martin and looking at the right GS rating that NASA offered.
And what was that?
I believe It was a GS-11 that I came over as, I think it was.
And what was your title?
Came over as a power and sequential system engineer on the Mercury program. And immediately went on to Gemini and stayed power and sequential.
Was it difficult obtaining the job?
Well, my first interview was with a fellow named Bill Durrett, and I explained to him how I enjoyed hands-on hardware. And he was very quick to tell me that, well, we want people to oversee our contractors, and they're the ones that do the hands-on hardware. And he didn't offer me a job. And I think that was the reason. He felt I was going to be not the kind of an overseer he wanted, which I would not have been. And then I interviewed Ted Sassine, who I worked for many years. And he had a fellow named Welby Risler that actually did the interview. And Welby liked me and offered me a job, and I went over in March of '63.
When you acquire your job over here, how long does it take for you to leave Orlando and live over here?
It didn't take me very long because my first wife and I were living in a little one-bedroom apartment, so we didn't have very much. And with the Martin Company, I think I gave them 30 days notice. So within about a month, we were living in Indy Atlantic.
What was it like down there at that time?
Really cracker, Florida. We were about 3 blocks off the beach, and Indy Atlantic was very small. It had probably no more than a half a dozen little stores, a couple of restaurants. Melbourne was very much what is the old downtown Melbourne today. So it was all fairly small.
What's your average workday like? Are you there in long periods, or do you have a set schedule?
In the early days, we were probably 8, 9 hours a day. It was an hour's drive up there, an hour's drive back, and we'd average at least a good 8-hour day. But that was transitioning out of Mercury into Gemini. When we really got into a launch schedule, we were putting at least 10 hours a day. So we had a lot of long days, and very quickly after MA9, when we were all being shifted over to the other programs, NASA participated in a program that was to go to the factory and help in the final checkout of the vehicle, the Gemini in this case, and help get it down to Kennedy. Several reasons. Number one, we would be a lot more familiar with the hardware, and as the government representatives, we would be right there and understand what the configuration of the vehicle was that we were going to bring down. As I recall, excuse me, I was going to be up there for 3 months. I was going to go up as a backup power and sequential system engineer to my friend Bill Criddle, who was going to be lead for Gemini 2, which is an unmanned vehicle. And then I was to stay as lead for Gemini 3, which was the Gus Grissom John Young flight. And we stayed a year. So that 3 months very quickly went beyond what we had thought. My wife and I had a big old black Weimaraner, and we were living in Indy Atlantic and had to have a place to store the stuff in our house. So we stored things in, I think, 10 different houses. A piano here, some boxes there, a little bit of furniture here. So when we went to St. Louis, we pulled a very small U-Haul. It's me and Nita, the dog, and a U-Haul. Stayed in Clayton, and didn't realize at the time that Clayton was a rather high-priced neighborhood, but it was the only place I could find an apartment to take a dog. And the guy that owned the apartment was a German hairdresser, and he was quite a guy. But we enjoyed that year in St. Louis. Nita went to school at Washington University, and those were 10 and 12-hour days, all the time, because we always had problems.
What types of problems?
We ran into mainly electrical test problems since I was power and sequential. And of course the power and sequential system interfaced with all the rest of them, ECS, the guidance, flight controls. And we were normally always there in support if one of the other systems had a problem. Because when they were looking for the wiring and the total sequential activity, we would be there to help them do that. So one night we came in and we were having electrical problems with one of our systems. It was a lot of interference, electrical interference, and several of us just decided, well, let's just go back and hang in there till it's done. And that was like a midnight. At midnight, we finally found our problem, and it happened to be in a ground support equipment, and left. One other problem we had was with one of the computers. We fried a computer one night, and I'm convinced it was my second shift power and sequential guy putting voltages in at the wrong pin on the connectors that led from the Gemini down to the Titan, as we had some steering commands that we could actually steer the Titan if necessary. And I was put in charge of the troubleshooting to find out what had happened. And I remember the McDonnell project manager, a fellow named Bob Seat, came to me next day and invited my wife and I to go to a hockey game with him and his wife, and the head of McDonnell and his wife, and I'm just a lowly system engineer.
Mac McDonald?
Yeah, Mr. Mack was there. And we went to the hockey game, first one I'd ever been to. And the next day I made a decision that was not popular with McDonnell. And never got invited to another game, a cup of coffee or anything after that by these guys. But
What was it that was not popular?
they did not want to do some particular aspect of looking into the problems with that particular computer failure. And of course I was going to do everything. I said, I'm going to look at every aspect of this thing, you know, the ops guys and the pad leader and the system engineers and the equipment we were using, because we had a fluke meter that was capable of dumping quite a bit of voltage back into a system. Not a lot of current, but a lot of voltage. So there was things that we were going to do, and they just wanted to get on with it. They wanted to get on with it, take it out, get a new one in there, and move on. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. We're going to find out first what happened. And then that same computer, we eventually got a new one put in there. And then one of the inspectors somehow discovered that there was an adjustment screw he thought was loose. And how he found that out, I'll never know. We had a discrepancy report on it. And I said, man, I can't see pulling another computer. This is ridiculous. And the computer guy said, well, we can't touch it. So I used to always carry a small screwdriver in my pocket. So I went down late one night and I asked one of the inspectors to point out the exact problem, and he pointed out the screw. And it was either an adjustment screw for one of the functions in the computer, or it was a retention screw for one of the cards in the computer. And I thought, well, if I start to tighten this thing and it starts to catch, then it's probably the retention screw. And if it doesn't, continues to turn, it's the adjustment screw. It doesn't make any difference anyway because there's already a DR on it. But they didn't want to do that. So I waited till everybody was gone. I just went up there. Sure enough, it tightened, so I tightened it as tight as I could. Then I went and found the same inspector, and I says, come here, let me show you something. And before he could stop me, I put my screwdriver up there and tightened. I said, see, it's not loose. Well, he turned me in, and my boss had me in the office the next day, and he took my screwdriver away from me. So after that, I got a smaller one that I could hide down in the pocket, so he couldn't tell me I had it. But my boss, John Williams, he was our big boss. He was up there with us. And he told me several years later, we got talking about that experience. He says, I almost had to send you home. He says, I just had too many complaints about you from those McDonnell guys. And some of them they'd catch me working on hardware, which I wasn't supposed to be doing. But they all left for lunch one day in the White Room up there, and we were looking at some relay panels that we thought we'd blown all of our suppression diodes on. And when they left, I couldn't see. I said, "You guys, we're so close to finding out if these things are blown or not. It's lunchtime." So I looked around, nobody was there but me, and I continued to test all the diodes. And all of a sudden, I recognized somebody was standing next to me, and it was one of the shop supervisors. He says, "How you doing?" I said, "I'm doing very well." He says, "By the way, who are you?" And all the time I had my hand over my badge so he couldn't see I worked for NASA. I said, "Well, I'm through here now." So I started disassembling everything. He says, "You work for NASA?" And he turned around and run out. And of course, by the time he got back, I was gone. But he turned me in, and of course, John talked to me again. And then one night, we were checking the retro stage on Gemini 3, and couldn't get power anywhere, and I kept reading the procedure along with the Mac guys. They'd read them or I'd read them, didn't much matter. And I finally got down, crawled under the stand that the vehicle was on, and one of the cables was disconnected under there. Just a little old jumper cable laying there. And I come out just yelling, "God damn it, if you guys would do what you're told, we wouldn't be in this shape. You got to learn to listen." And I threw that connector, and it just went right on in under the vehicle and out on the other side. So the next morning I was back in John's office again. So but we had a good time. We had a lot of incidents. I was very hot-tempered, fiery, in charge. I'm the NASA guy in charge. And I kind of had my comeuppance a lot up there.
What was the overall relationship between the NASA individuals and the McDonald people?
Overall, it was excellent. We had a very good team. The controversy seemed to be between us and some of the plant people. Not the guys that were launch operations McDonald that were going to come back with us and actually do the launch operations here at Kennedy. So any kind of problems we had was normally with the engineering at the plant that were going to stay there, design guys, some of the technicians, some of the ops guys that were internal McDonald and wouldn't come with us back to the Cape. And we almost formed the group that was the Cape group. It didn't matter whether you had a McDonald badge or a NASA badge. And when we were here, if I was in a blockhouse or a NASA guy was in a blockhouse, he would basically be on the headset talking, solving a problem out at pad 19, and a McDonald engineer would be out there with a tech. Or if a NASA guy happened to be out there with the tech was there, the McDonald guy in the blockhouse, you just reverse roles. Signature-wise, though, we always had the right engineering and QC safety signatures, so it wasn't as though we were just doing whatever we wanted to do. We stayed to our procedures. But we had an excellent team. Probably the best teaming that I was exposed to at all was between NASA and McDonald.
What did you think of the Gemini vehicle?
It was marvelous. It just never gave us a problem at all. Liked the Martin guys. Bob Adcock, as a matter of fact, our treasurer, was one of the test conductors. For Gemini 1, before we went to St. Louis, Paul Donnelly was our NASA ops guy, and he came one day to me and he says, this umbilical drop test you guys are doing is just basically a test for power and sequential. Says, we don't really want to put an ops guy out there. Says, why don't you just, sit up here at the test conductor console and do both roles. You can be the test conductor as well as the power and sequential guys. What am I supposed to do as a test conductor? He said, well, you got to interface with the Martin guys since they've got the gantry and the vehicle, and you know what you want to get done as far as these tests are concerned with the umbilical. So, okay. So I'm out there a little nervous, and we go through all our tests, and I'm paying more attention to what we want out of those umbilical drop tests than basically interfacing with the Martin guys. They're in charge. So it comes to the point that we're through. Gunnar Wendt was pad leader on the pad. So I read the right response. It says, okay, pad leader, clear the pad. And I'm going over here and talking to my McDonald guy, my counterpart, and I'm looking down the procedure, and I turned to the Martin guys, say, Martin test conductor, lower the gantry. And I'm over here talking to the Martin guy. And about 5 minutes later, I heard Gunner Went come on the net, and he says, test conductor, pad leader, we're ready to clear the pad. And I thought, oh my God, I could see the pad starting to move with Gunner and these guys up there. And I jumped up, threw the headset off, and hollered at the Martin test conductors, don't lower the gantry, our pad leader hadn't left yet. And of course, they just laughed. They gave me the biggest laugh. They set me up, because they knew I wasn't paying any attention, and they weren't about to lower the gantry until they had a safety check to make sure everybody was out. But, young Power Sequential test conductor here, I could just see Gunner and them starting to fall all over the place as that thing started coming down. A lot of fun with those guys. We were out there for, when we came back, I was out there for 3, and they had a TV system that they could control from the Martin consoles. I think it was the Martin consoles, but there was a good-looking reporter came in there, and she was up on the gantry. And we weren't doing much but watching her, and as she would move, I decided I'd just go grab the TV controls and track her. So I went over, nobody was watching me very much, so I was tracking her up there, and somehow I wrapped that TV camera into some cables and destroyed a motor trying to get it out. So I very carefully went over and sat down like I'd never done a thing, and just waiting for those guys to come and find out. A couple of the NASA guys saw me doing it, but they kept it quiet. So we had some fun. It wasn't all work.
I wonder if we could, before we go deeper into Gemini, if we could go back a little bit to when you first arrived with MA9. When you get this job for NASA, were you hoping that you'd be on a manned launch right away?
I don't think I ever gave it a thought. I just, I knew my buddy Bill, and Bill says, here's what we're going to do, and you're going to be a Power Sequential guy, and I was working for him, and he had mentored me all through my Vanderbilt years. I had practically no money, and he was a veteran with 3 kids and used to feed me. So I just kind of trusted him to do whatever it needs to be, just let me know. There was never any doubt that I was going to be on the manned vehicles, because I hired into manned spacecraft. So it's either you're going to be on the vehicle itself or you're going to be on the ground support equipment, one or the other, which feeds it. And it turned out that in the NASA house, the system engineer was responsible for both flight and ground. So we had all of it, end to end.
What'd you think of the Atlas launch vehicle versus the Mars?
Had no thought on Atlas, since I'd never worked on an Atlas. Because we had, I'm sorry, I'm back on Gemini again. Didn't pay any attention to it, because from the interface of the spacecraft down, that was somebody else's bag. And I totally trusted them guys. They know what they're doing. The only thing I've got to worry about is the actual interface itself. Make sure the mate is there, and that was the mechanical guys like Sam Bedingfield.
So where are you at during the launch of MA9?
MA9, I was in the ready room on pad 14. On Mercury, the NASA guys would probably be in a trailer. Most of them would be in a trailer. And those of us that were kind of new and just getting into things, stick us over in the ready room in case they had to have some help for the guys that were actually the lead on that particular vehicle.
Where's this trailer located at? How far from the pad?
The trailers, as I recall, not too far from the pad, just back away from the pad on the away from the ocean side. But the Power Sequential guys seemed to be their home, as I recall. A fellow named Mark Guidry was the NASA Power Sequential guy when I came in for Mercury.
What did you think of your first manned launch? You're right there.
I honestly don't remember. The only thing I can remember is the gantry wouldn't lower, and some idiot wanted to hook up a bulldozer and a chain or a cable to it, pull it down. And immediately cooler heads prevailed. I said, you know, that is absolutely ridiculous. And they fixed it. I think we postponed it for a day or something, as I recall. And then they fixed whatever the problem was. But I was not directly involved with sitting on a headset.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I had a headset, I was listening, but I did not have a role. So I just don't recall.
So this was almost like a training measure for
Yeah,
you.
it was more like training. So I certainly didn't make any decisions. As I recall, I don't think very many guys did that day, except you know, the launch vehicle guys themselves.
And during this time, when you first are working for NASA, construction is the acquisition of the property in North Merritt Island has already occurred. Construction is beginning. Where is your office during this very early phase?
Hangar S Annex. We had, as a matter of fact, Bill Criddle and I faced a wall. Our desk faced the wall. My desk was jammed against a window. Bill was right next to me, and behind us were file cabinets. And if I wanted to get out, Bill had to get up and move so I could get out. Then he could come back and sit in his desk. We were that cramped.
And you're away during the vast majority of construction out at KSC, the construction of the VAB and stuff. You're up in St. Louis,
Yep.
correct?
When we came back from St. Louis, at one point we moved out of Hangar S into either A&E or A&O, I forget the ones, just directly east of Hangar S. Spacecraft was in the one on the west side of the road, and launch vehicle was on the building on the east side of the road. And we spent a lot of time running back and forth to Merritt Island, verifying lab setups and, you know, hard tables and things like that for the guidance navigation system. So we spent some time over there, but it was mainly just verifications.
When you come back from St. Louis, where are you living?
Moved into Titusville in a little efficiency apartment. My wife and I and the dog.
What made you pick Titusville?
Thinking back, we had originally intended to go to Merritt Island, not into Atlantic, since that was kind of far down, and we, you know, too much driving. I remembered all that drive, and was looking at lots on Merritt Island, and then decided to come up here and look around, and liked the area a lot better. A little slower pace. I wasn't really the beach nightclub type hang around. I remembered running back and forth from Indy Atlantic up and down the beach, and a lot of traffic problems even then. And that was, I think, one of the driving factors was to get out of that traffic.
What was here in Titusville at that time?
I'm pretty sure Sears Mall was here. The downtown Titusville area was there. Big Apple Plaza or Sandpoint Plaza, which is practically nothing now, was here. Very small town.
Where was your wife originally from?
She was from Freeport, Pennsylvania. I met her in Orlando in a dentist office. She was a dental hygienist.
So for coming from a small town in Pennsylvania, this was not a major shock for her being in this area?
No. She'd been in Orlando for several years.
Well, back to your activities with Gemini. With the coming of the first Gemini launch in '65, there's this big gap between Cooper's launch in May of '63 and the first launch of Gemini 3, Gemini Titan 3 in March of '65. During this time frame, the Soviets are still launching. For you, do you think that this downtime period is really giving the Soviets a large advantage in this race as we're, heading toward the moon by the end of the decade?
From a race standpoint, obviously. But from a technology standpoint, I don't think so.
So you weren't personally concerned by this downtime period?
No. Just never thought about it. And mainly because we were just totally enmeshed in what we were doing. The first manned vehicles are always a mess. Your design is not really exactly where you want it to be. The quality test program is still ongoing and is forcing changes even as you're trying to test and do acceptance testing back in the factory. So we were very busy.
How'd you find the atmosphere at Cape Kennedy, because now it's Cape Kennedy, to be? In relation to the heat, mosquitoes, the climate, all that kind of stuff?
In those days, the heat didn't bother me. I think I was impervious to a lot of stuff. I was so wrapped up in the space program and what we were doing here. You'd come home and you'd mow the grass and you'd get hot and sweat, but we were young back then. It didn't matter. That's just to be expected.
You say that you're wrapped up in the space program. Did you pay a lot of attention to things outside of this area, national and international events, or were you really almost had tunnel vision?
We were more tunnel vision than anything. The war happened and we were just barely aware it happened. And where we basically would change that tunnel vision or focus is from the TV, from some of the reporters that would come down that would write about other things, like in Aviation Week, things like that. We obviously were always aware of what the Russians were doing from the paper and from the news media. But unlike some real space buffs, we didn't go just read article after article and try and get periodicals from overseas, whatever. Just wasn't on our plate.
For you, Gemini being this important component to the march to the moon, did you have any doubt in your mind in the mid-60s that we would reach the goal by 1970?
I thought it was rather aggressive. It says, from my view, sitting down here and realizing what all is involved in making one of these things to the point that you can launch it and it's going to do the mission it was intended to do. And here we are thinking from Mercury Gemini into something that is now a monster vehicle. Go to the moon and back. Say, well, look what it takes us to do a Gemini. Think about what it's going to take to do an Apollo. How in the world can we ever do that in the time that we've been given? I don't think that any of us ever doubted that given enough time and money that we could do it. But we sure felt that was a tight schedule to do it on.
And the monster vehicle of the Saturn V, when you are working on Gemini, a lot of this is progressing along with the von Braun group and everything. The VAB is being constructed. What's your impressions of the VAB when you first see it?
I think the only impression was, this is one big son of a bitch. Because I used to go out State Road 3 going home at night, and I could see those guys pounding steel beams into the terra firma of Florida, just 24 hours a day, day after day, night after night. And my first thought was, when are they ever going to start going up? Because all I could ever see them do was going down, trying to establish that base. I had guys involved in the activation once all the buildings and all the systems got put together, but the actual building itself, we were just, we were lookers. Mm-hmm. All we ever did was look at it and say, well, it's got to be more for the launch vehicle guys than us. And the launch vehicle had an awful lot of input into the size and capabilities of that building. And then, of course, design engineering were the ones that went off and did it with Corps of Engineers. So we were lookers, we were voyeurs.
When you see the Saturn V for the first time on the crawler, what you think of the Saturn V?
I thought it was beautiful. I said, man, that is the sleekest thing. Anything that looks that good, it has to work.
All this is happening simultaneously as Gemini is progressing. So let's go back to your actual experiences with Gemini now.
Okay.
You're on GT1, unmanned. Any involvement in GT2?
Only in St. Louis, because I was the backup power and sequential system engineer for my friend Bill Criddle, who was lead. So when Gemini 2 left, I stayed in St. Louis. He came down here. And I remember when they were going to launch St. Louis, they were going to launch Gemini 2, I was in St. Louis. And Mr. Mack came on the intercom system and says, okay, we're in the count, we've got a minute to go. And he got on down and says, okay, and we're down at T-minus 10, 9, and he was counting because he was on the phone with these guys. He says, we're down to T-minus 3. So, well, we've had a cutoff, he says. And he just went right on talking about, he says, well, that's the way it goes. He says, however, and then he started talking about one of the McDonald projects that had just had a success. So he went right from a disappointment right into something that was good. Never missed a beat. I'll never will forget sitting there listening to that guy thinking, man, he is good. He's not going to dwell on, why we didn't get off on Gemini 2 today. He's going to dwell on something that's good.
And was it a McDonald problem, or was it a
Do not recall. Do not recall.
With Project Gemini, the NASA aspect, there's also coming online Blue Gemini, man-orbiting laboratory for the Air Force. Did you have any interaction at all with that program?
Zero. Not at all. We had John Young and Gus would come up and participate in testing. And Gus was particularly private about things. He didn't like people looking over his shoulder. And he would, when he'd get in a Gemini, there was a camera behind him looking in to try and, see what they're doing and make sure that the switches are where we thought they were going to be put. And he'd get a technician to stand in front of the cabin. So all you'd ever see was this technician's back. Well, then management would go and jump all over this tech, so he'd have to move. Well, the next thing you'd find, somebody would have a coat over the camera. So Gus was very picky about people looking over his shoulder. Just didn't want it.
Was he different than the other astronauts?
I didn't know him well. He seemed, from my standpoint, a little bit more withdrawn. Of course, we had John Young, who was new, fresh. Just everything was great. Everything was a wonder, and just needed answers for everything. Every time we'd have a problem, John was there. And what are you going to do about this, and what happened? And actually, he would drive you nuts. We had one incident where the retro rockets in the retro stage was under test, and we sent the firing commands into the power simulators, and nothing happened. And it turned out that we had some very stiff armored cable that covered the wiring, and somehow the technicians had been using it to hold on when they would move in and out, and we had popped the majority of the wires off the connectors. There was like 4 retros, 2 firing circuits for each one, so we had 8 connectors with around 16 or so different pins, and half of them were broken. Just snapped right off where they go into the pin. And John was just hopping the next morning. He stopped me and one of the McDonald guys, a fellow named Darrell Forthman. And he said, what are you guys going to do about this? This is terrible. We can't fire the retros. I said, well, John, we got this all figured out. He says, what we're going to do is we're going to wrap special tape around these connectors. And when you guys try and fire the retros and they don't fire, you do an EVA and you go back and you unwrap this tape and you read it. And it's going to say, "Our Father, which art in heaven." And he was ready to kill me. But after a while, he got to thinking, well, maybe that wasn't so bad. These guys are just trying to lighten things up. And even as much as 5 years ago, he'll tell that story every now and then about the problem with Gemini 3 and the retros not firing and reading the piece of tape. But he was always involved in stuff. He would come to our procedure reviews. Of course, Gus never did. He just depended on John. And we had a big argument about what to call the astronauts when they were in the spacecraft. Because we normally would have spacecraft observer. And the SCO could be a technician or astronaut, either one. And he would get on the headset, get in the cabin, and do what we'd tell him to in the way of tests. But John didn't like to be called an SCO. He thought the astronauts ought to have a different title. And of course, we never changed it in St. Louis because everything was already written and we had everything already categorized. We came down to the Cape with Gemini 3, and one of the first procedure reviews, John was there. He said, "All right, now, what are we going to do about this SCO?" He says, "We need a good name for the astronauts." And I said, "Well, we've thought about that, John. And we believe that DS1 and DS2 would be very appropriate for you two guys." He says, "Well, that's got a pretty good ring for it." He says, "What does that mean?" I said, "That means dumb shit." And we used to call them DS1 and DS2 every now and then if we could get away with it. Now, Gus, he didn't like that at all. But John, he was getting to where he was getting okay to work with, and he would have fun with us. And after Gemini 3 came back, my boss called and says, "You are in big trouble." I said, what's the matter here? He says, "Well, down on one of the signs in Cocoa Beach where these guys are coming back, it says, 'Welcome home DS1 and DS2.' and they know you did it." But it wasn't me. But Gus thought it was me.
Who was it? Did you ever find out?
I think it was my boss. I think he's the one who did it. But after that, when I came off of Gemini 3 and went right into Apollo, and was made a supervisor in power and sequential system for Apollo. And we were running back and forth to Houston and Downey, and if I'd see Gus anywhere, I would hide until he got away from him, because I was still concerned that he was going to, come over and pop me one. I would not have put it past him at all.
I'm going to pause here for a sec because we're about 2 minutes away, so we need to switch out that tape right there. So when we left off, you had indicated that you were moving from the Gemini program right into the Apollo program. How did you take that? Did you want to finish up work on Gemini, or were you more excited to stay on Apollo?
I was very excited about moving on to Apollo because we had to start putting some emphasis on the design reviews and, setting up an Apollo organization. We were basically a little mom and pop organization on Mercury and Gemini, and all of a sudden here we are, we're syndicated. It's huge. And I also had quite a bit of trepidation because two of the guys that I was going to be a supervisor for, and here I'm a brand new supervisor, and I just love to work. I just love to go out there and troubleshoot and work with my McDonald guys and test and get these things ready. So, I'm having to look at a different kind of participation. And two of these guys were old enough to be my father, and of course resented the hell out of me. And the one guy, he just immediately decided he was going to go back to Houston. He wasn't going to work for this guy, this young whippersnapper that didn't know anything. And of course I'm sitting here saying, well, I've got 4 years of ground support equipment design and Martin Company. I've got Gemini behind me, a year in St. Louis, and I'm not as dumb as you think I am. But this other guy, this fellow named Bill Patterson, is dead now. But Bill just kind of got his feathers up, and he was going to resist. About that time, it was time to send a team to Downey, acceptance of the first Apollo. And Bill just informed me he wasn't going to go. I said, what am I going to do? I said, okay, got to do something here. So I called him into an office I had borrowed, since all we had was desks. And I shut the door and I says, now, Bill, and I'm nervous as a cat on a hot tin roof, and I'm trying not to show it. I says, now, you only got two choices. You can come in here in the morning and bring your TDY papers to go to Downey, or you can bring me your resignation. And I got up and walked out, and just shaking when I left. And all night, man, I had a bad night. Oh my God, what's he gonna do? What have I done? This is terrible. And went in the next morning, and I'm just tense. And he walks in, and he says, okay, I'm going to Downey. And I thought, I couldn't have enforced what I told him the night before, but it worked. And then I went to Downey with him the first time he went out there. And we finally got to where we were, pretty good with each other. And the other guy, though, he left pretty quick back to Houston. And then the rest of the guys are around my age. And it worked out pretty well. We did a lot of design review back in those days and had counterparts in Houston. So they were the design guys that worked directly with the designers in Downey, and we were the checkout guys that had Rockwell types that came and helped us do the checkout. But the acceptance in Downey was very similar to what it was in St. Louis for Gemini. And it came in pieces when it came down there. Apollo 9, not 9, 11, 9 and 11, I think. CSM 9 and 11, unmanned. And coming into the O&C building, we had our checkout rooms, our ACE, automatic checkout equipment rooms, in the O&C building. Now the big Saturn I was launched over at pad 3437, which was across the river 7-8 miles away. And all of our signals were through digital lines that went under the river. And nobody ever really paid much attention to us sitting over there in the O&C building. We were back, upstairs in a room. And of course, here's the blockhouse with all the launch vehicle guys, and the big guys who'd come down from Washington. That's who got all the press, who got all the notice. So we're pretty content with that. We had then get near the interference that the launch vehicle guys did, and we liked it that way. We had maybe one person in Blockhouse 34, and he was an ops guy, and he was there mainly to interface with range safety and the launch vehicle guys, and whatever you happen to need in the way of support at the pad. Now our contractor pad leaders, technicians, etc., were all down at the pad, or they were in trailers. So we had quite a workforce out there, but the engineers weren't. They'd only go out there for problems. We had a problem that raised its ugly head between a launch vehicle ground computer, which was an RCA 110, and that was the one they used for monitoring and controlling the test of the launch vehicle. Over in our ACE room in the O&C building, we had a 160G, Honeywell 160G, and that's what we used to do all our control of testing. One of them spoke like 12-bit and the other one spoke like 24-bit language. They didn't talk to each other. Now the Apollo had steering commands from the command module to the launch vehicle, just like the Titan. That if something happened to the launch vehicle control interface unit, that the guys in the command module could actually take over and steer the vehicle. Fortunately, it never happened. But we had to check those circuits out. And the instrumentation loop was basically an air loop from the command module over to the ACE rooms into our computer. And the ground path was back through the A2A lines and up through the bottom RCA 110 so that you could take a complete loop. Send your commands, verify telemetry. They want to do it automatically. So GE Daytona was put under contract way back to come up with a conversion unit in the blockhouse that would allow the 160G to talk to the 110. So our big boss, John Williams, says, well, we need somebody out there. We need a technical person out there. So he came to me, says, you're power and sequential. These steering commands are basically wires. You go out there. I said, okay, that'll be fun. But I need one Rockwell guy with me. So I told him I wanted this fellow named Bucket Milliken. And Bucket was a Rockwell guy who was in engineering ops over the years, just a really good guy. But he and I just used to butt heads.
Was that his given name, or was that his nickname?
No, it was William something Milliken.
Why did he get the nickname Bucket?
Millican, milk can, Bucket. Just an old milk can, Bucket. But Bucket was a great guy. Just loved Bucket. And he and I worked together well for many years. He was in the shuttle program. So Bucket and I go out, and we're the technical interface at the launch vehicle. And we've got a big long row of consoles in 34 that belongs to a spacecraft. The IU guys were at the end of that set of consoles. A bunch of young guys, just really good. And our ops guy was seldom there. He was somewhere else on telephones, and he would be there for the launch, but he didn't have a lot to do because it was mainly done back in the ACE rooms in the UNC building by the ops guys over there. So here we are, Bucket and I, we're ready for this launch. And the two of us are there, and we had a good time during the whole process and got to know a bunch of those guys. When the launch occurred, all of a sudden all the lights in the blockhouse went out. Some sound system was going wow, 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 and we looked up at one of the little black and white monitors, and all we could see was fire. And Bucket and I both dove under the console. We actually fought to get under the console because we thought the damn thing was falling on the blockhouse. And of course we get under there, and we start looking, and we notice all these other guys are looking up at the TV monitors, and one of them was looking out the telescope and said, well, maybe nothing's wrong. So we very sheepishly get out, get back in our seats, you know, we're looking around to see if anybody's seen us. And everybody was looking up, so nobody saw us do that. But it turned out that what happened, somebody early on had left some power cables where they shouldn't have down around the flame trench. And at liftoff, it burned them in two, so we lost power. Well, the vehicle's gone by then. And at the same time, it was normal, I think, for a Doppler system to produce this sound in the blockhouse. Of course, we didn't know any of that because we were total novices in the blockhouse for Saturn. And then the TV camera was on the burn pond, for the hydrogen burn pond. So all those three things together convinced me and Bucket that we are in deep trouble here. So that's when we decided to go under the console.
Which launch was this?
This was our first unmanned Saturn I, our unmanned Apollo. And the Apollo, I believe, was Apollo 9. And then for Apollo 11, we felt like veterans, so we had a much better handle on that.
With the Apollo program, are you paying a lot of attention to what's, as you're working with Apollo, are you paying much attention to what's being accomplished with Gemini, or are you single-minded?
Very single-minded. When I moved on to Apollo, Gemini was, that door was shut. Now, we had guys on Gemini that we knew, and happened to be in Houston for one of the Gemini launches. Went up to one of their conference rooms, and everybody was sitting in there watching the launch. But we were there for an Apollo discussion, and I'll never forget seeing a camera swing away from the pad and look down into the palmetto bushes. And there's a guy squatting down back over there behind the palmetto like he's hiding. And then the camera sweeps, and we see the Cape Police come roaring in there and chase this guy down and arrest him. And it turns out that he and his buddy had swam down the ocean from the beach up there, Playa Linda, and were coming in so they could get a good view of the Gemini launch. Now, if they'd had it aboard, you know, it probably landed right on them and killed them. Well, his buddy gave out and never made it down there, but he did. And it was one of the national TV companies that caught him. As they were scanning around looking at things, one of the guys said, what's that guy doing down there? But I know we watched that for a good 15 minutes. The TV kept that going. So it added a little bit of spice. And that's the only other thing I remember about Gemini once I went to Apollo. I knew they were going. I knew they were successful. But other than Gus and John, all of the Gemini guys who all came to Apollo, that's where I met and knew them, was on Apollo.
Your workload, you've been promoted. Work hours changing?
Later, just always there.
What's your title?
Let's see, my title at that point was Apollo Power and Sequential Section Chief.
GS level?
I think it got to be about a 12. I think I was a 12 by then, and somewhere in that neighborhood I got to be a 13 as a supervisor.
Interaction between yourself, you've had experience with McDonnell people, with spacecraft. How about the North American people?
Frustrating. They felt like originally they worked for Houston, not for us. And when we would go and try and interface and provide an oversight and do things, a lot of them would just tell them that they just say, no, we're not going to do that. Or just look at you and not do it, just not even bother to respond. But we had a JSC resident office guy, a fellow named Archie Morse at that time, who has also passed away. That was really good. And several trips talking to Archie, and pretty soon we got it straightened out. But Rockwell just seemed to resent our interference a lot more than McDonnell. And eventually, that kind of went away, and we established some very good working relationships with an awful lot of Rockwell guys. We felt that they were really controlled too much by Downey, so that the Downey JSC connection was always there. But that's who they responded to. That's who they really belonged to. And until we really got contracts with the different spacecraft contractors at Kennedy, we always had some difficulties dealing with some of the Rockwell guys.
The spacecraft itself, you had such knowledge of the Gemini working in St. Louis. What did you think of the craftsmanship of the early Block 1, Apollo 1 versus the craftsmanship of Gemini?
Hard to remember. So I remember some of the first design reviews we had. Obviously, we were bringing our Gemini experience with us, and that's mainly what we were depending on for any critique that we had of those systems. Had some really good JSC counterparts. Between the JSC NASA badge and like one of the Rockwell guys who was at JSC working with him, and myself and some counterparts here at Kennedy in Rockwell, we had a pretty good design operations team that anytime we went to reviews, there was the 4 or 5 of us there. Anytime we had any concerns, we were always on the phone with these guys. When we got into problems in our testing, got into discrepancies, always just really good ties back to those guys. And it wasn't just in my system, it was in other systems. The basic building block of the system engineer, the design engineer, whether it was JSC or Marshall, the contractor support for the design centers, the contractor support for us, that building block And let's say you had 15 different systems on Apollo. Those 15 building blocks were the basics of doing anything. Design reviews, getting your procedures all agreed to. What do you want me to do in these procedures? Basically, before we came up with the requirements documents that the two centers were told to put back on Kennedy after the Apollo fire. We didn't start out with requirement documents. We started out with the schematics, the specifications, any kind of operating procedures, and between all of that, us guys at Kennedy would come up with the operating procedures, the launch and checkout, the loading procedures, inspections, buildings. But we depended almost entirely on the drawings, integrated schematics, the actual build-up drawings, design drawings, and then we would take that, get red lines and redline the circuits as we would put the procedures together to check them out.
I'm going to have to pause here just for 1 second because I need to change out this tape. Give him some guidance on some things.
Why have you never taken the plastic off of those legs?
It gets in my car and it just gets beat up, so I figured just let it stay there. Right, when we left off, you had been talking about the Downey individuals and the relationship with KSC versus Johnson. I wonder if you could comment a little bit maybe about the relationship versus Johnson and KSC amongst the NASA employees at that time, in the mid-60s.
I think at the working level, system engineer to system engineer, we got along famously. We really seemed to have good teams. At some of the center director levels and directorate levels, there seemed to have been maybe a little more friction. Like who should be in charge of certain things, who should really be doing all the ground support equipment, the facilitized GSE. Kennedy was pretty well set for the big facilities themselves, bringing in the VAB, the Launch Control Center, putting in the systems like the big elevators and the power and air conditioning, HVAC systems to run the buildings. But Johnson and Marshall always had the feeling that if we build a spacecraft, we need to build all the ground support equipment that it requires, and we'll ship it to you. And in Apollo, it got down to a lot of the systems like the LOX and the LH2 loading systems, the environmental control system, the hypergolic system, the cryos, all of those things that had to feed a spacecraft. It just made sense for Kennedy to do that. Designed and built there, but there was a lot of involvement from the two design centers because of the interface to the vehicle. So there was an awful lot of coordination between our design engineering group and the two design centers. Now we would get involved, the spacecraft and launch vehicle guys, because we had to use it. We had to use that ground support equipment and all our procedures to interface to the vehicle in order to meet those requirements necessary to check it out, load it, put it together, inspect it. So there was a tremendous amount of coordination and travel and telephone calls between the guys at JSC, the guys at Marshall, the contractors that were actually doing flight hardware, contractors that were actually doing the ground support equipment at Kennedy. So, it was a Chinese fire drill all the time between the number of people that were trying to communicate. And one of the things that was used was the interface control documents, the ICDs, that define the interfaces of the flight hardware to the ground. And every function that came across those interfaces, be it fluid, mechanical, electrical, digital, didn't matter what it was, those interfaces were what the designers designed to. So we spent a lot of time with documentation and assuring that documentation was correct. And you build your procedures based exactly on the as-built drawings. So that was probably, the thing I remember a lot is the constant travel and the constant telecons and constant one-on-one discussions to get all that stuff to play. Mind-boggling.
And that's really what I've been picking up. It seems to be that in the earlier programs, in Mercury, you get that transition in Gemini, it was more compact, more personal. Did you find that when you made your transition from Mercury, Gemini, into Apollo, that the organization is becoming
heavy, more complicated, a lot more people to deal with? Because on Mercury and Gemini, we had long-run cables from the blockhouse to the pad. And you could actually, draw your circuit from a switch in the blockhouse down through the long-run cables, up the gantry, across to a piece of GSE, and right to the spacecraft, which was very simple. And that was two contractor interface, McDonald to Martin. Now here we've got Saturn, and we've got how many stages with their contractor, how much GSE with theirs. So you start looking at all the interfaces between contractors now, and interfaces that need to be defined between contractors on the launch vehicle as well as spacecraft, as well as ground support equipment. Your interface control documents are getting very bulky. I remember Rocco Petrone once got so frustrated with ICDs, he brought everybody into a big conference room and took one of the ICDs and unrolled it and completely covered the walls of the room. And it was a large conference room, just to make a point about what all was required and you had to maintain in order to identify all of the circuits. It was a big job.
Since you brought up Rocco Petrone, let's, if you could comment on a few large personalities within the Apollo program, and he is certainly one of them. How'd you find him to be?
I liked Rocco, and he liked me for some reason. Right when he came over from the program office and came in to be our launch ops director, had occasion to have a little interface with him early, and for some reason he liked me. And for the first, I forget now, it was command service module. For the first command service module, launch mission rules, I was the guy that pulled all of them together for Kennedy. And I worked with the JSC guys, it was all spacecraft, and then with all the rest of the guys at Kennedy, and actually was the integrator to pull that thing together. And somehow, Rocco and I had miscommunicated on how this needed to be done. And like the day before we were going to have the JSC down here to go over the launch mission rules, we went over those rules, and Rocco said, "This is not what I want." I said, "Oh my God." So I spent the rest of the night with half a dozen guys rearranging and getting everything the way Rocco wanted it. I stayed up all night and called my boss at the time, a fellow named Mike Wedding, and he went by the house, got me, razor and toothbrush and toothpaste so that I could at least clean up a little bit. When Rocco came in the next morning, I think my big boss told him that I'd been up all night making that thing work, and I was dead on my feet. So when I got up to start talking about launch mission rules, I got up to the podium, and of course the view graphs were being shown up on the big screen. And as I'd show a view graph, and I'd say, "Well, now this is," and about that time Rocco would start talking. And he talked through those mission rules, and all I had to do was stand there. And he knew he's just going to help me. He was going to do what he could. When I had my first problem at work, I had to go over to the infirmary and come back to my desk. And after I come back about 10 minutes, there was Rocco standing next to my desk. Want to know how I was. So he wasn't just, an overpowering larger-than-life individual, he did have concerns for his people. And it wasn't just me. It surprised me to look up and there's Rocco. You know, rather than me coming to him, he had come to me. But we had a lot of incidents with him. He loved to hold forth. He would sit up at his desk up there and go for hours. Never have to go to the bathroom. And I always remember he was rather a large man, and as he was talking, he would lean forward and scratch his big old belly with both hands, you know. And you knew then that was basically, I think, his, okay, I'm ready to go another 2 hours now. But he could put the fear of God into people. He was a very impressive fellow.
Did he attempt to intimidate a lot of new people under him? Do you think? I
think that was just his normal way to operate. He was intense. He had, you know, some sense of humor, but not much. You didn't kid around with Rocco much. You could, but it had to be, you know, rather thought out, not just that you're always kidding with Rocco like you would with some other people.
Did you know Joe Shea?
I knew Joe. I was acquainted with Joe. I didn't know him well. And I mainly knew him involved in Apollo 1 in the fire. For the fire, Joe Shea was going to set up his own review board at Kennedy in the crew quarters. And I just happened to be the guy that stumbled on him doing it and turned him into Rocco. And Rocco went to Thompson, who was the head of the Apollo 1 review board, and next thing you know, Shea's gone. He's back to Houston. But he was intercepting every work authorization document that we would approve to go and do testing for things we wanted to find out associated with Apollo fire. And of course our teams were made up of guys from JSC, guys from Kennedy, guys from Rockwell, and in a lot of cases maybe a guy from headquarters. And I was on the integration team that looked at all the other panels, that basically put a final report together and would approve all of the activity that people wanted to go and have people expend effort on. And they would write basically test prep sheets, which we had used and did use for all of our activity on Apollo. And they'd write up everything that we wanted to do, and it would come to our panel, and we would basically say, yeah, you know, we understand it, and here's all the rest of the stuff we've got to do, so we'd try and coordinate the schedule. And I got to noticing that all of a sudden the JSC guys would have them, and it'd be a couple of days before we get them back. And just happened to be up on the third floor by the crew quarters one day talking to our headquarters rep, and kind of standing in the door looking down the hall. And I kept seeing these JSC guys going into the crew quarters. I said, what in the world? And at one point, the door was open enough, and Joe Shea was standing there. And I says, those sons of bitches, they are up there running their own board, and they're going to prove that it was Kennedy's fault. That's what they're here for. Because I can remember when, right after the fire, when not Max Fouché, but Dr. Ralph Langstrom, came in the next morning with a bunch of guys from Kennedy, from JSC on one of the NASA planes, and he was going to see what we had done. We're here to find out what you guys have done wrong. I'll get back to that. But anyway, when Patron went and talked to the head of the review board, they banished Shea, sent him back to Houston. And things got a little better after that. It got smoother. But going back to the fire itself, I had been switched from Apollo to the lunar module. we'd split that project office that we had in spacecraft operations to the command service module and the lunar module, and I picked up the LIM. I was doing the technical planning for the joint shot from 34 and 37, command module off 34, lunar module off 37 for Jim McDivitt's Apollo 9, and they would do all the rendezvous, you know, do EVAs and actually prove a lot of stuff with two vehicles. And separate story, never happened. I came by the control room going home that afternoon when they were doing those tests, and sat in the ace room with our project engineer up there, who was Henry Creighton. And Henry and I chatted for a while and listened to the headset and heard all the communication problems they're having. So I said, you know, see you later, Henry. So I left around 6 o'clock, went home, and sometime after dark, our boss, Mike Wedding, came to my door and knocked on the door and told me we'd had a fire and that the astronauts had been killed, and that I should put myself on standby because I was probably going to be called. And you know, sure enough, 3 o'clock in the morning, they call, says go to the data room. Everybody had been locked up, the data had been secured, and all the spacecraft data, which was in our ace control rooms in the ONC building, had been taken down to our data room. And the boss told me, he says, there'll be a guard there, and he's expecting you. So when I got there, I introduced myself to the guard. He, you know, checked my badge. And this was probably 4 o'clock in the morning by the time I got out there. Well, you know, the launch vehicle guys, spacecraft guys are all still locked in their control rooms, you know, making sure that all the data is secure and that they've got everything that had anything to do with the vehicle. And so, you know, I proceeded to go through all of the data and listen to the voice tapes, and about 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning, I heard this racket coming down the hall. So I walked out, and here's Dr. Langstrom and a bunch of guys coming down the hall. So I get between the little table and the wall and try and block the passageway. I said, you know, Ralph, what are you doing here? He says, well, we've come down to find out what you guys did wrong. We're going to look at the data. And I says, you can't do that. It says, we haven't established all of the rules, and the review board hadn't been established yet, and you can't come in here. This is secure. Well, yes, we are, too. Felt this arm just kind of moved me out of the way. And this guard just stood between me and this bunch of JSC and put his hand on his gun. Never said a word. And for what seemed like 10 minutes, which was probably less than 10 seconds, nobody said a word. Everybody just stood there. And I says to myself, you know, this guy is going to shoot Ralph. He is going to shoot Ralph if Ralph tries to come around him. Well, Langstrom just turned beet red, turned around, and just bulled his way back through the guys behind him. They all left. The guard sat down. I says, would you really shot that guy? He says, well, no, but I didn't want him to know I wouldn't. But I'll never forget that. That guard must not have been any bigger than me. But when he did that, he was 7 foot tall, 320 pounds. But then, you know, very quickly we set up the review board, the activities, and put the 21 teams in place, and went on from there.
What's the mood amongst the workers?
Very depressed. You know, actually, just the first several days, it was like unbelief and total depression. Just couldn't believe what had happened. This just cannot happen to us. No way can this happen. But then the rigor and the organization set in. All of them activity that was going on, just you didn't have time to think about anything now. But let's go get data, let's go find out what we can, let's solve this thing. And it was a lot to be done, because we had to get the spacecraft off the pad. We sent it down to one of our buildings where we could get into it, you know, try and visualize what had been going on. We had the suits down in one of the places, so you could basically take a look at everything that was there, all the physical data, then all of the telemetry, everything we had was there. The people that were there, the interviews with them. So it took a while. And then a fellow named Al Mardell from Houston was on the integration panel. And he was the head of the integration panel. And myself, Rockwell's chief engineer, Ray Pyle, was also on it. And then the one guy from headquarters. And he kind of just went along with what we wanted. And Mardell wrote a report that said, this is what caused the fire. And I took it down to Ray. I says, Ray, I didn't think we had agreed on this. He says, no, we didn't.
What did he say?
Well, he said it was... Oh, memory fails. But our point was, there's no way you can take any of the things that we had investigated and said, this is absolutely it. We said, here's the 4 or 5 things that we felt that were most probably a cause and effect that could have happened, that did happen. And this could have caused a fire. And this is most likely what happened. But not that this is, by God, it, and this is what we got to go fix. And he says, well, I don't need you guys to vote. I says, I think you're wrong, Al. I says, if you take a look at this final report, it's going to require everybody's signature. And I says, now Ray and I have already decided we're not signing it the way you've got it written, and here's what we suggest you do. And he was livid, because we were just tape guys. And he was the big design center guy, and he was in charge. But he went home and thought about it that night, come back the next day, and he had rewritten it so that we could sign it. And we had all agreed, based on all the data that we looked at, that the most probable cause was the wiring coming over one of the sharp panels down in the lower equipment bay down by Gus's feet. And they had not closed those panels out for this test. So here we are with 100% oxygen, 5 psi over atmospheric pressure, and come to find out later, an unbelievable amount of flammable material in that thing. And we pretty much traced what had happened. You could hear somebody moving around, and we think, Gus was down he was out of his couch. He was in the lower equipment bay, which is nothing wrong with that. Don't do that when you're in flight. And we believe that what happened is he was moving around, he stepped on that cable, those wires coming over that sharp edge, and created a short. And the minute you got that spark, here's this flammable material, and then it propagates very quickly, and we found later that the Velcro would actually explode in little fireballs. And everywhere that fireball went, started another fire. Netting in there, and it was very flammable, and just an accident waiting to happen.
Were many of the materials present in Gemini?
Yes. But we never, very fortunately, never had an incident where a spark was created that would create basically a fireball that would go into something that would immediately catch a fire. That doesn't mean that we didn't at some point have some shorts in some equipment on Gemini, but it was behind the panel, self-contained. Even though it was 100% oxygen, there wasn't any material for it to start a fire. And I don't remember that we ever had anything that was horrible. I do remember that we had some equipment that one of our flight control guys was looking at after one of the Mercury flights that showed shorting, but it was back inside the panel, so it didn't have a way to get out and do anything. And looking back, though, we were very lucky on Mercury and Gemini. It wasn't all skill; it's a lot of luck.
You had indicated that there had been several other possible causes before
Yep.
that you decided on. What were some of the other possible?
One was a glycol leak, coolant leak, that had happened sometime earlier that they never really found something. My boss, Sassine, just wrote a book that I just got that he still thinks that's it. And the leak, once it leaks and all of the fluid evaporates, you have a residue left. And that residue is a very volatile residue that, as I recall, it doesn't take anything to create a fire, create a little explosion like a small bomb. And here you've got this residue, and supposedly you have something that reacts with it, either a foot or something that would scrape that. And I never gave that a lot of thought, but several people did. There was another theory that at the end of Gus's seat there was a panel that might have been open, that he might have kicked that panel and created a short that we never could. As a matter of fact, I got in the capsule and tried to position myself where the couch was, and it's hard to do, so we had to bring in another. I think we brought in boilerplate spacecraft 14. I think we brought in spacecraft 14, and we had it available that you could go and get in, and it was configured as near as Apollo 1 as we could get it. And you could lay in the seats and get a feel for where each guy was, what kind of equipment was around, where all can he touch, where all can he stand. And I think it was from that some of the guys came up with a foot kicking something at the end of the couch. There was also one that we were using a non-qualified battery that shorted out, and that was even brought up as recently as 2 or 3 years ago by Grissom's brother, saying you guys have been covering up the true cause of the accident all these years, and here's data that people have brought that says it really was this over here, and you guys never even talked about that. And Hugh Harris called me and informed me this was going on, and I refreshed Hugh's memory about everything that went on and about Gus being in the lower equipment bay. And I think he went back and talked to his brother, or somebody did, but whatever happened, they didn't pursue that any further. But we were, all ready to go through it again. And it's been brought up several times over the years that NASA was providing a cover-up and not providing all the data, and it's just not true. I was there every day.
Do you know where the data currently is?
No. I know where bits and pieces of it is in my closet. Some action items that we got out of headquarters and things like that. After we turned in the final report, there was a congressional hearing, and JSC and us and Marshall all had to send people up there. Of course, for us, we sent up Dr. Davis and Rocco Petrone, and I forget who else was with him, but he had to have a support crew. And I happened to be in Bethpage continuing our lunar module activity at the time. And here again, my boss, Sassine, called. He says, I want you to come to Washington. We're going to need to spend 4 or 5 days up there supporting our guys. So I came on into Washington. Ted was there. We had probably about 4 of us, maybe 5. And we had a place there in the headquarters building. And every night after the hearings, we would get a record. We'd have to go through those records, and everything that our guys said, we would have to verify it was correct. Or if they said, we don't know, but we'll find out, we had to find out by the next morning. And we had, at Kennedy, and I'm sure the rest of the centers did, we had 24-hour coverage teams. We had guys in charge, pick up a telephone, and Bill Stelgis was the guy that we were using down here. And I could call Bill and say, this is what I need. And, he had contractors, he had NASA guys, anybody he needed to help him get those answers. So the first day, we got a report, we read it all, decided what we needed, called up Bill. this is what we need. He's going to fax it to us. So I go down to the fax machine, and there stands George Abbey. Well, Joe Shea is there. Joe Shea's got a place, and he's down the hall down there, and George is his right-hand man. And George has got all this stuff coming through from Houston. And I must have stood there 45 minutes waiting. And I finally got the stuff out, and I'm getting later and later, and we know we still got to do all our answers. I decided that wasn't going to happen again. I says, I'm not going to sit here and wait for Abby. So the next day before the reports ever came, I called Stelgis and I says, now when I call you, I want you to start faxing me the countdown procedure. And then when I find out what I really want, I'll call let you know, and you can just slip those sheets in. Did. So I got the report, and I immediately called Bill. I said, start faxing now. So by the time we got to what we wanted, and I went down, I called Bill, and I went down, and there stood Abby, watching that fax machine. It is just pumping out page after page. And he's standing there, this big scowl on his face. So, how you doing, George? So I watch what's coming out. And when I got what all I wanted, and I says, now stop sending when you get through with this. I took this pile of stuff. My God, it must have been a basket full. Went down to the office and I skimmed off, 20 or 30 pages we needed and dumped all the rest of it in the trash. But I did that for the remaining time we were there. I'd call Bill and he'd start faxing that same countdown procedure. Abby never did catch on. But Shea, he really was going to prove it was us. We were the bad guys. But he was one of the guys that was a fatality of Apollo 1. They fired him. They fired his counterpart in Rockwell. I can't remember his name now. But Joe went on to, I think, Kodak, got a lot better job than he had with NASA. Then he showed up on Space Station when Golden was up there. And Golden called him back to do something. They were having a big review with a lot of the high-powered NASA guys. And Shea got up there to do whatever he was supposed to do. And apparently just embarrassed the hell out of himself and everybody else. And Shea actually, or Golden, walked up and walked him off of the platform to get him out of there. Apparently he's had just Alzheimer's or had lost it or something. But that was the last time we'd heard about Joe.
How long ago was that?
90, 91, that time frame. But one or two times that I had interfaced directly with Shea, I didn't hold him in the esteem that I held George Lowe by any means. But Shea was a pretty sharp fella. He was no dummy. Rather arrogant.
You comment on George Lowe?
I had the utmost respect for Lowe. And I was around him enough on acceptance reviews of spacecraft like lunar modules that I got to see how his mind worked. And of course I'd hear him on telecons a lot, and I'd see him at flight readiness reviews. And I liked him, thought a lot of him.
Did you have a lot of interface with Kelly up at Grumman?
Tom Kelly. Not a lot, but we did interface with Tom there, and of course when we were running lunar modules through the Cape, he was always down here. And then I ran into him again on Space Station up at headquarters before he died. I think he died this past year.
Yeah, probably about 18 months ago.
Yeah. But I always liked, there's a spider over there on the wall.
That's the little one.
I always liked Tom. I always thought he didn't fit the Grumman profile. He was more like a Rockwell guy from, just kind of easygoing, laid back. Of course, some of the other Grumman guys were intense. Always coming at you, aggressive.
What do you consider to be the Grumman profile?
Grumman profile was they really wanted to be independent of us. because they were more so than Rockwell in that I built this stuff and I know what it's all about and I don't need your help. Quick, short, tempered fighters. If this is my position, I'll fight you till I win. However, once you got over a discussion or an argument and you had an agreement with them, you know they'd keep it. They had a lot of integrity, a lot of pride in what they were doing. Very family oriented. They felt a real bond with each other, and would just throw the walls up around them sometime. And much more so than McDonald even. See, McDonald was kind of a family oriented activity also, but the Grummans were almost fierce about it. Good guys. Turned out to be probably the best launch ops team that we had in all the different contractors. Like several of us thought that.
I think that some of it has to do with that this was their first venture into space. And
no. They had a lot of contracts with the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
So they had produced high-tech hardware. Now they were very proud that they got the lunar module contract and actually put the guys on the moon. But they already had that sense of family and integrity, and it was there. I don't think there's anything that that contract did. Just added to it, maybe.
Any personality with them being the only, they're New Yorkers, they're from Long Island, markedly different than somebody from St. Louis or California.
Yeah.
That present any particular problems?
Well, initially, you always felt that they were mad at you. What have I done to make them mad? Just because I wear a NASA badge? But it's kind of the way a lot of them were. George Skurla, who was their base manager and went on to be president, died last year also. I always liked George. He lived in fear of Rocco. He couldn't understand why Rocco was always on him. And he would always talk about Rocco liking O'Malley better than him, because Rocco and O'Malley seemed to get along a lot better. But George just took a lot of stuff very personal from Rocco, that probably the same kind of discussions with O'Malley. It just didn't mean anything to O'Malley. George was very sensitive about his company, his people, his product. Very proud of it. I used to walk by his office going home in the afternoons, and I could see him in there, and a lot of times I just stopped, chat with him. And over a period of weeks and months, a pattern would develop, and I knew it was going to happen. And I'd get my visits down to like once a week, because every time I'd go in there and sit down, start talking to George. How you doing, George? This, that, and the other. What's been happening the last week or so? And all of a sudden we'd get back on the same script. Why does Rocco not like me? And this, that, and the other. And he'd go to an incident that happened up on one of the platforms around the lunar module with a paint can hanging down. And Grumman wasn't even responsible for that level. Rockwell was. But Rocco got all over George about it because George had people there. He says, your people see that, they'll take care of it. And for some reason, that just always was stuck in his craw. That Rocco would get on to him about something that wasn't his responsibility. But he would always get, and I just represented NASA. After about 5 minutes, I wasn't Charlie, I was NASA. And he would just unload. Same script. And if he'd go by you in the hall, he would invariably start talking to you. He'd get you against the wall, and he had a bad habit of poking your chest with his finger when he would talk to you. And after a while, that gets rather bothersome. So after that happened to me 3 or 4 times, I just got in the habit of knocking his hand away. I could see it coming, and I just keep knocking his hand away. And I don't think he ever realized what he was doing, and he never realized that I was knocking his hand away. And he'd just keep on talking and keep on poking. But I like George a lot. He was a good guy.
What of O'Malley?
Hate him. One of the few guys I could learn to hate. He was an arrogant asshole. He made fun of people. He put people down. He, once he knew he had it over you, like Walt Caprian, who was our launch director for a while, he would just walk all over Cappy, and Cappy would let him. Because Cappy let Bob Gray walk all over him. He let almost anybody walk all over him. But O'Malley was crude. I've seen him at gatherings where there's been large numbers of people, lots of women, and just used language that was just not fitting, absolutely not fitting. And he and I almost got in a fist fight once. Came close. We were early shuttle, and we were trying to get our plans together, and what are we going to do with software, what are we going to do with the configuration, just a lot of stuff we had to come to grips with. And we were going to have a meeting with his guys and our guys. John Williams was still our boss. And I walked to his office. I always tried to get along with people that were in charge because I needed their people. I needed their help. And I went to his office to talk about this meeting that we were going to have, to talk about how we're going to get our software set up for shuttle. And he's sitting there, and I'm sitting there, and his secretary's there, and he says, we're going to do this, and we're going to do that, and we're going to do this. I says, well, Tom, I said, try not to use that particular one. And man, he just exploded. God damn it, Mars, you're never happy with anything. You're this, that, and the other. I says, well, you're damn right I'm not happy. I want the best of everything. And he stood up, and he was coming at me, and I stood up, and of course he's bigger than me. And of course I'm losing, he's bouncing into me, and I'm bouncing back. I can't push him. And then we both turned and started out the door, and the secretary was just cowering, because we're yelling at each other. And we start out his door at the same time, and we stick. And we're both, I'm against the side of the door, he's against the side of the door, and we're against each other, and we're pushing, trying to get out. And about this time, I'm beginning to think how stupid this is, how ridiculous this all is. And still we're pushing, and I'm got my head half out the door, and I can see up and down the hallway, and his head's all sticking out. And there's nobody's in the hallway, but there's these heads all sticking out looking up the hall. And we finally got out, and I went straight down to my boss, John Williams, and man, I was livid. About that dumb son of a bitch O'Malley, And O'Malley, he would not even look at me for months. As we'd walk down the hall, if we'd pass each other, he'd look at the wall rather than look over at me. And John Williams, he always enjoyed them kind of fights, but it was bad between me and O'Malley. So John kept trying to act as the go-between and get us back on terms. And we finally got to where we could put up with each other, but I just lost all respect I might have had for him in a short period of time. And there's another incident with him. Early shuttle, again, when we would all go to Cappy's office, and O'Malley would come with his guys, and our bosses would come with us, and we'd go through the status of things, where we're going, what are our problems. And I went in there one day, and two of my facility guys were in there. And O'Malley was jumping all over these two facility guys. I said, what the hell are you doing? Well, they can't do this and they can't. I said, excuse me. I said, these are NASA guys here you're talking about. This is not guys that work for you. They work for me. Of course, nobody in the room disputed that. They work for the government, but they were assigned to me. And I says, and this is what they're charged to do. If you got a problem with that, you better get a grip on it, because they're going to do it. And then we went on to something else, and I started to bring up something. And O'Malley says, well, you can't talk about that in here. I says, what the hell you mean I can't talk about this? Well, Cappy and I have an agreement. And Cappy says, well, Charlie, we've had a talk, and we kind of decided that unless our staffs have talked about something that we can't bring it up here cold. I says, what in the crap is wrong with you? You mean I got to read this sumbitch's rights before I arrest him? I says, I'm the NASA guy here. I am an oversight person for you. I says, if you don't want me to bring you information in here, I says, I won't. I got them left. Well, John Williams used to love them fights. He'd sit there and roll that cigar. And George Page just, looked around. And Sassine wasn't paying that much attention. He didn't know what the fight was all about. And I didn't go back. I would not go back. And I told you, my boss, Sassine, said, I'm not going back to his meetings. I says, you go. I says, as long as he lets O'Malley run that meeting, and it's not a NASA meeting, I am not going to have anything to do with it. Wouldn't go back. About 2 weeks later, he called. Why don't you ever come to my meetings anymore? He says, nobody tells me anything. I said, Cappy, I was in there trying to tell you stuff, and you let that sumbitch O'Malley run the meeting for you, and I'm not coming. So until you start running that meeting, I'm not coming back. And I think it was months before I ever went back to any of his meetings again. So O'Malley was terrible.
With Capran, was that just his personality? He just didn't like conflict?
Elmer Fudd, just the nicest guy in the world. But if you ever were in a fight, you sure don't want Cappy around, because he's not going to fight.
What about Williams, his personality? Comment on it a little more?
John Williams? John was a good engineer. I thought he was a good manager. Liked to have a lot of fun. Did not like to socialize. Didn't go to anything except beer ball games. He loved beer ball games. He'd have us out until after dark playing beer ball games. It'd be so bad you had to listen to where the ball hit because you couldn't see it. He just went toward where it went thud. But he did like those beer ball games.
Is that where they have the canister of beer on each of the bases?
No. Our beer ball games was we'd have the ops guys play engineering or play inspection, and whoever won, the other team bought all the beer for that particular game.
In Apollo, is there less interaction between like in socializing, is there less interaction between the contractors and the NASA people than there were in previous Gemini and Mercury?
Now, from my personal viewpoint, we didn't really have a lot of social interaction with the McDonald guys or the Rockwell guys. We did a lot of, run out to lunch, run out to have a beer ball game, have some kind of social where a lot of people were involved. But I never socialized a lot with the contractors. It just worked that way. I lived up in Titusville, and I socialized with the people directly around me. The Grumman guys lived in our neighborhood, and I did socializing with them. A lot of them went to the church that my wife went to, so we socialized through the church. But that was about it, and it didn't matter whether it was the McDonald guys or the Grumman guys or whatever. It's just who was in your neighborhood. Some of the things that we used to in Apollo, we would play ball games with the crews that were coming in. And of course you'd have the prime crew, the backup crew, the sport crew. So you'd have a lot of the astronauts there. And I remember the one game that I will never forget was one with Pete Conrad's crew. And I needed to get an edge because those guys are pretty good. So I got this really good-looking, shapely gal to play the hind catcher. And I says, look, you wear just as little as you are comfortable with. Short skirts, tight blouse, whatever. I says, now, when them guys come up to bat, I want you to reach up and pinch him in the ass. And tell him you get 2 of those for every batter. And she, no. I says, no, it's just going to be fun. I says, or just pat him on the ass, anything. So she came all dressed up, all sexy. And of course, the first guy that got up there, she reached up and patted him on the ass, They thought that was great. then here comes Pete. So Pete gets up to bat, gets a little pat on the ass, hits that ball right out of the park, reaches around and grabs the hind catcher and throws her over his shoulders and runs the bases with her. But that was fun. We had a lot of fun with things like that. And then, you know, the crews would have maybe a little appreciation party for some people. And for Pete's flight, he actually flew my 2 wedding rings to the moon and back. Still got them, still got it documented. And just before launch, he invited maybe a dozen people to a little party that he gave. He and Al Bean and what's his name, the third guy, the pilot, Conrad, Dick Gordon. So the 3 of them just, you know, they had maybe a dozen people at a motel room down on the beach down there, just show them they appreciate them. And I always felt, you know, like that was really nice of him to do that. Liked him a lot.
What about, you mentioned the catcher being female?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of female employees for NASA at this time?
We had, in spacecraft, I don't recollect but 1 or 2.
What capacity were they in?
The one lady I remember was an engineer in the ground computer area, ACE. She's still around today, as a matter of fact. We had a female biomed girl in Gemini, but then she wasn't there for Apollo, as I can recall. In Grumman, there was a ground computer supervisor, an older lady named Peggy Hewitt, I think was her name. But she'd been around Grumman a long time, so she had to be in her 40s, late 40s. But don't remember Grumman having any more ladies. I don't even remember any inspectors. I don't remember. I think it was really Shuttle before we started getting most of the ladies. In Apollo, I can't remember whether Judy was Shuttle. I don't know whether she was ever Apollo or not.
How about minorities?
Very few. We had one black engineer that was in my project engineering office in Shuttle. And he got killed coming from Orlando. But back in Apollo, I'm trying to think, we might have had, I don't even think Dan Evans was in Apollo. I think the contractors might have had 1 or 2 blacks.
About Hispanics or Asians?
Yeah, had some Hispanics. Ernie Reyes, Jose Garcia. You know, there was a few of those coming out of Gemini and Apollo. But it was pretty much a white male community. Great majority.
I'd like to step back into 67. You have the Apollo 1 fire, but also in 67 you have the first launch of unmanned Saturn V. Were you here for that?
Yeah.
What'd you think?
Didn't have a lot to do with it. I think my boss Sassine was doing something with that one.
Did you see it?
Yeah, and I'm trying to remember if that was the one we were going to shoot with a load of molasses. They needed basically a referee fluid, I think, as a weight for one of the tanks. And they were going to fill that thing full of molasses and shoot it. And some organization heard about that and started raising all kinds of hell about wasting food. And I believe we ended up using a saline solution that gave us about the right consistency we were looking for. And why they had to do it, I just don't recall. But if I remember correctly again, It seemed like I remember them blowing something up, but not a good memory. And like way up, you see this big white burst. Of course, that could have been a New Year's Eve party I'm thinking about.
Where were you on the launch? How far away?
On that one, I was over on the Merritt Island side.
Can you comment on the power of it that far away?
No. The ones that I remember were the Saturn V's off pad 39. And until Skylab, I was always locked up in the ACE control room over in the UNC building, so we never saw anything. We had a little black TV about this big, and you could see, liftoff. That was about it. And I remember once some of us snuck out in the final minutes of the count and ran down to the end of the UNC building to try and see a Saturn. But we were always so concerned there'd be a hold. And then anytime they'd have a hold, somebody wanted an ambient status check for the limb. Well, the limb was sitting there dead. Didn't have any power, so it really didn't need anything, but there was always somebody wanting to do something. So we were always very concerned that we don't want to be out of the room if somebody wants to do something, which was a false concern. Nothing could be done. But Skylab all of a sudden came around, and I didn't have to be in the control room. We had, once we launched the basic Skylab itself, which was the OWS and the multiple docking adapter and the airlock module and the ATM, then the other three launches were all command service module. And I was pretty good buddies with a lot of the astronauts at that time. They'd always invite me to come out to the astronaut launch view area. And I remember the first time I stood out there for one of those Saturn launches. It was a Saturn, it might have been for the 5. But that was just overpowering at the heat, and there didn't see much heat, but all the flame and all the sound coming out of that thing. Just made you want to cry. See that.
I'm going to pause here for a second because we're going to... we should progress into some of the specific launches and get some of your reflections. As you're working with the Grumman crew, your involvement with Apollo 7 is not going to be anything extensive, as there's nothing with Apollo 7. But this is the first launch after the Apollo fire. Were there any specific concerns or anything as you're getting, towards this launch? Did you have any feelings about this particular launch?
I don't recall, other than that was Schirra, Cunningham, Isley. The thing I remember about that is the altitude chamber run. And we did 5 chamber runs on that vehicle because we just kept having problems with it. And for the last chamber run, I think we had some ECS concerns that we needed to redo. Environmental control system. Had a big red-headed guy from Rockwell in charge of ECS. I used to always call him Aunt Jean because he reminded me of my Aunt Jean. Can't remember his name anymore. But I was in the little VIP room behind the test conductor in the ace room. And I'm telling you, that Schirra, he just was nasty. He got to the point that he was irritated, didn't want to be there, didn't want to be in that run. And ECS guy would say, we wanted to, he'd give him a command out of the OMI, and Schirra would say, what the goddamn hell are we doing this for? Wow, 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 wow. He just went on and on. And my friend at the console would say, now the reason we're doing this, and he would very calmly take about 3 to 4 minutes to tell the crew, here's why we're doing this, just to get back at them. And this went on for about an hour, just almost everything that they were supposed to do. It was just cursing and carrying on and bad attitude. And I finally told the test conductor, a fellow named Gordon Turner, as a matter of fact, and I used to work for Gordon at the Martin Company over in Orlando. And I told him, I said, you know, this is ridiculous. We don't need to subject the crew to this anymore. And, you know, we've met our objectives for this thing. Let's go ahead and abort the mission. We were just taking the rest of the procedure because it was easier to do. And he was a little bit, he says, I can't abort the run, this, that, and the other, this, and that. I said, tell you what, you tell them that it was my fault, that I aborted the run. I says, and I'll take responsibility. It'll be an engineering call. So he told Wally, he says, okay, we're going to abort the run. He says, about goddamn time. He says, we should have quit this thing. We should have never, just on and on and on. But that's, I'll always remember that. It's just, did not believe, couldn't believe that they were as belligerent as they were about that mission. And then they did the same thing in flight.
Do you think that killed Isley, his career?
Yes, it killed Cunningham's career too. Pretty sure it did. In Kraft's book, you know, that's one of the things he said. He'd see to it they didn't fly again. Now, he might not have said it exactly like that, but I'm sure it's what he meant.
How about overall, do you think that with the astronauts, NASA as an organization could be vindictive? Like,
oh, yeah. Absolutely. People are people. Doesn't matter where they are.
how about Apollo 8 again?
Apollo 8. Apollo 8 was not originally in the program. And what had happened there, the joint mission that we were going to do off 34 and 37, when we got LEM 3 out of Bethpage, it was in such bad shape that we just finally ground to a halt there in the UNC building and testing. And Sam Phillips, who was our Apollo program manager, wanted to review what's going on, why can't we get on with this. And since I was the lunar module chief PE, they picked me to give the pitch. And I got Fred Hayes and some of the support crew, and then of course some Grumman guys and NASA guys put together, here's the shape it was in when it came from Bethpage, here's all the open work, here's all the discrepancies, here's what's happened since it got here, and now it's dead. Until we get some mods and get some problem solved, we can't do anything. And the presentation took probably about 5 hours. Had Rip Bullender, who was the Lunar Module Program Manager out of Houston, and his deputy Owen Morris, who took his place when Rip left. Dr. Debus was there, Joe Shea from Grumman, and my bosses, me, and started giving all the problems. And of course, I had a lot of help from Houston. And when they would talk about a certain modification or a problem out of Bethpage, and you know, Houston would say, well, here's what we thought, and here's where we thought we were. Of course, everything that happened to Kennedy, I was having to justify. Okay, and Shea had a flight about 1:30 or 2 o'clock that day, so he left early. And I thought, well, he doesn't think much of this, you know. He thinks this is just another pitch. And some very short time later, they canceled the mission. Says, we're not going to make it, and this mission is canceled. No more joint 34-37. And we were devastated. Oh my God, you know, this is terrible. And there was a fella named Tommy Attridge who worked for Grumman, and he was one of their module managers. And Tommy Attridge, back in 1953, was flying a jet for Grumman out over the Atlantic in a test flight shooting at a target drone, and somehow got into his own casings and filled his aircraft full of holes with his shell casings. And I remember I was in a physics class in high school at the time when we heard about it. And we had our professor go up and do all kinds of trajectories and speeds, and we asked, it could have happened, and here's how. So when we met Tommy Attridge, and they said, oh yeah, I remembered him. But he was a fireball. And he called me at home after they canceled the lunar module, 3 o'clock in the morning. I want to know what's going to happen here. We are going to fly. Who do I have to talk to get this reversed? I says, Tommy, it's not going to be reversed. That's the way things are. Well, that command module is using the same things we are, same components, and I'm just going to have to go to the press. I said, oh my God, I hope not. Because we had during the Apollo 1 fire investigation, a Rockwell inspector that put out an Apollo report. And it was, I can't remember his name now. But we had to stop everything we were doing. Barron, his name was Barron. And the Barron report was very critical of everything. He said this was just a big accident waiting to happen. No, stop a minute. But, everything that we were doing, we had to put on hold for a minute and answer everything in that report. And I remember that. I said, oh my gosh, we don't want to go through this with Tommy Attridge. So the next morning, I went and told my boss about the conversation. So, this guy's threatening to go to the papers. So, man, he immediately went to see Rocco. And about 2 days later, Joe Gavin. Joe Gavin, who was president of Grumman, shows up in Rocco's office with Tommy Attridge. And that was the last time we really saw Tommy Attridge on a program. He was still around, but he was banned from anything. Things like that would happen, though. You'd get people that would get so emotional, so passionate about something, that they're going to strike out at something else. And Tommy just happened to do that at the wrong time. I just couldn't see stopping everything we're doing now just to go try and answer Tommy Attridge's questions. But Rocco fixed that for us.
So with...
But then we had this perfectly good command service module sitting there in the ONC building, and the powers that be were all talking about where we are and what we're going to do. And they said, well, let's go to the moon. And that's what happened, Apollo 8.
Did you think it was risky?
Very. Especially when we had to redo the service module right there in the ONC building, not ship it back to Downey. But we took it apart down there, put in the bigger tanks, and did what was required for those systems to go to the moon back. It's a good, great effort.
Where were you when the first images started coming back?
I'm pretty sure I was home watching them on TV.
What do you think?
Awesome. Unbelievable. We're really there.
Reconfirmed to you that we would make it by the end of the decade?
No.
No?
So LEM 3 was still sitting down there in pieces. And that had to get up there because that's where you had to prove all your rendezvous and EVA. But, things picked up after that. But we, when we finally got out of the polarity fixture, went into the altitude chamber, and we died over there in the altitude chamber for a while. We had more problems over there.
A lot of leaks?
No. The biggest problem we had there was the batteries that we were using were in a 90-degree position. Now, supposedly all of the filaments you had inside the batteries would soak up all the acid, and you didn't have any free liquid in the batteries. But, we put those batteries in there, and the acid ran all out of the batteries and onto the platform in the lunar module and down into the altitude chamber. It happened on Sunday morning. And of course, go running out there, and there's guys wandering in the chamber, with a huge 5-gallon jug of distilled water. You're not supposed to have any glass in there. I said, what in the world are you doing? He says, man, we got to get that corrosive stuff down. I said,
Why not?
go right ahead. Well, if you get glass in your altitude chamber, and it's just not a good place to have glass because people are walking around in there. You can get it in the spacecraft, and You just don't want any kind of material around your vehicle where people are it's hazardous. And glass is very hazardous. So we didn't want any in there. But in that case, you're not going to say, well, you got to go put that in a plastic container before you bring it in here. Because the whole time you're talking, it's still eating. We had a few more problems. I can't remember some of what they were.
Did you have anything with the tests in Houston with the Space Environment Simulation Laboratory? Did you ever visit any of those tests?
No. Until Shuttle, we didn't do much with Houston. They did their stuff, we did ours. Of course, we had the same simulators, command module and lunar module and rover simulators here at the Cape, so that the crew had a lot of practice time here.
From Apollo 9, Lem is on its way.
Apollo 9, McDivitt, Schweikert, and Dave Scott. Really liked Jim. He just liked McDivitt a lot. And he went on to become the Apollo program manager, and we got to interface with him even more. Once we got out of the chamber, out of the polarity fixture, and moving on to the pad, things kind of picked up. Things got good. And here again, we didn't see the launches. We're sitting up there in the Ace VIP room waiting for the command module to get going. And then we tracked the missions. We'd go back to one of our rooms where we could get the air-to-ground stuff and listen to all the stuff between Houston and the spacecraft. Of course, we never got on the loop because we had no talking parts. But we could follow all of the missions, same way the guys in Houston could. Get the data, look at the data.
With the problems that you had with LEM 3, what was your attitude toward the Grumman guys? I mean, did things get pretty tense?
Yeah. When we had the Apollo 9 flight readiness review, my boss, Sassine, was up at the front table with all of the program management, and I had come in. I was sitting in the back of the room, and Joe Gavin and his crew were sitting right in front of me. The base manager, the chief engineer, all those people. And around the end of the meeting, Sam Phillips asked, well, what do you think happened that all of a sudden things are getting good and we're ready to go? And Sassine, in typical fashion, he says, well, he said, them Grummans finally figured out we were serious. And boy, all of those Grums just come straight up out of their seat right in front of me, And then I guess Gavin thought better of it, and he just quieted it. He just put his hands out and made everybody sit back down. But you could just tell they were ready to kill him. So there was a lot of emotion, and it's all during the flow. And there was a lot of, some conflict between people. But it really worked out that we turned into a pretty good team. Good team. And one of the things that I always look back on was when Grumman first came, and we were imposing the way we do business on those guys. And here's, you're going to do it this way, and here's why we're going to do it this way, and here's the written word on our procedures on how we do business with each other. It kind of was hard to get them guys to do that. They just had their own way of doing things out of Bethpage. After about LEM 6 or 7, we were starting to back off a little bit and trying to ease up on them. And they were so ingrained in the procedures then, they wouldn't even think about not doing it that way. I thought, well, once you get these guys to agree to something, look out, because they're going to stay with it. That's why we were trying to make it easier.
And one of your trips to Bethpage, he was telling me, the motel room?
Bud Reynolds.
Yeah, it must have been Bud, yeah. It was recent, yeah. Did you really think that they were renting out your room during the day?
We knew they were. We caught them.
Yeah.
we came back at lunch to go in the room. We couldn't get in. You know, they locked the door from the inside, you know, and we could hear them in there. Oh, says, we thought you guys were gone. Man, our clothes are still in there. That was funny. We negotiated the price down considerably when we left.
Apollo 10. Dry run.
10, Stafford.
Young. Who's the third? Stafford, Young. Is it Cernan?
I believe it was. I believe he was command module pilot. Blur. Don't remember anything about that.
Really?
Yeah.
11?
Oh, 11, lots. Remember everything about 11. I was trying to think about Stafford. They were a good crew. I enjoyed those guys. But I had, we tried to keep some fun in the game, and out of Gemini, I had created an award called the Dumb Shit Award. That if the Apollo guys screwed up during any testing, when we had the debriefing, I'd have this nice form all filled out to who the crew was and what screw up they did. And so, you know, the astronauts were a little testy about getting dumb shit awards. And some of them, like Ed Gibson to this day, he'll mention his dumb shit award when we talk. But for Apollo 11, it was a good spacecraft, but that was the first one that had all of the equipment that was going to be used on the lunar surface. Because the rest of them just empty bays down there. We had what was called a crew compartment fit and functional that they do in the cabin, so that everything that goes in the cabin that they have to use on a mission, you try it out before you actually have to use it. Well, we did the same thing for this modular equipment storage area that had all of the stuff they use on the lunar surface. And we'd spend all day trying to get that ready, and Armstrong and Aldrin were there waiting on the test. And it was basically an ops function. But I was down there, you know, I want to make sure everything was okay, and Big Chief Lim PE, I got to make sure this is going to happen. Or if it's not, then we got to do something different. But we were sitting up on the platform up there around the descent stage, which is, you know, better than 10 feet in the air, and no railing at all up there. And we finally got ready for this thing late at night. Must have been 9 o'clock at night, and a couple of times I'd gone to the crew quarters and told them, why don't you guys just go home and tell us to call you when we're ready? I said, no, you know, we're here, we'll wait. So we got down there and we're doing this exercise. And the way we would get things off the platform, we had a high lift, a forklift, and a technician would stand on the forks and I'd raise him up there, and as Neil and Buzz would take things out of the equipment bay, hand it to the tech, and they'd lower him down to the floor and he'd hand it to somebody and come back up there. Well, I was standing up on a platform with another couple of guys. I said, now you guys, you know, stand here in case these guys start to fall off, you can catch them since we don't have any railing. Of course, I don't know how in the world safety ever let us get away with that. But at one point, Neil almost stepped off. And I caught him and put him back up there, you know, and says, hey, Neil, you know, 0G's not running yet, so you don't want to go falling off here. And we got through it and debriefed at midnight, I think, and sent the crew home. Just before launch, when everybody's in quarantine, Fred Hayes was a support crew on that one, and I think turned out to be backup. But Fred came down and said, why don't you come go with me? And we went up to the crew quarters, and Neil is there. And he presented me with a Dumb Shit Award that Neil and Buzz and everybody had signed. He had a nice picture of the limb with nice ruby red lips on it and little eyebrows, you know, like it was a lady limb. And it showed Neil taking a head first dive off the platform. And Buzz is yelling, hey Neil, 0G's not running. That's the best award I ever got on the whole programs I ever ran. Still got that somewhere. But that's kind of the memories of LIM 5. It was a good vehicle, but we still had a lot of problems to get through before we ever could launch it. And then, you know, the mission, And I think we all sat in our little data room in the ONC building and listened to the descent. And I know for the last 10 minutes we hardly breathed, just waiting for that thing to hit. That was probably very traumatic to all of us, sitting there waiting. Is it going to land? Is it going to crash? Is it going to tump over? Is it going to have to abort? Very tense. Probably the most tense moment of anything that I can remember just prior to sit down. Even Apollo 13.
When they land, what are you thinking?
Can't be happening. Cannot be happening. But it was. I remember Conrad, after it was over and we were processing him for his mission, we were talking one day. He says, I was sitting there in the mission control, and he says, I couldn't get my feelings right. He says, one minute I'm saying, make it, and the next minute I'm saying, abort, because if you don't make it, I'll be first. He says, I just couldn't come to grips with my feelings that day. He come close to being first. A lot of good memories about LIM 5.
Moving on to Apollo 12.
Mm-hmm.
Anything stand out?
Lightning strike. I thought sure as hell that one was aborted. But that recovery was just fantastic, the way they got that thing back up and going. And the guy in Houston that did that, as I recall, had remembered something happening on a simulation and told him what to do and got it right back up again. And it was fun watching Pete and Al on the moon. They were animated. They talked a lot. See, with Neil and Buzz, it'd just be long periods of nothing. Silence.
What about Neil Armstrong's personality?
Not much of one. Just very quiet fellow. Not intense, but quiet. Dedicated.
So who you thought would be the first? When Apollo was beginning?
I don't think I ever gave it a thought. Never thought about things like that.
Apollo 13.
Well, I thought when, I think it was Sassine that called me at home and said they've had a problem and they're running out of air and power, and I just flew out to the Cape because we had our little monitor room set up where we listened to all the flights. And I, honest to God, thought I was going out there to hear Fred die.
You were very close with him?
Yeah, Fred and I are still very good friends today. But very quickly, we came to realize that we can get out of this. And we weren't really aware that they had gone through a lifeboat mode to the lunar module. And all of a sudden, all of this is coming out, and things need to be done, and we and the Grummans are starting to go through different procedures ourselves on trying to recharge command module batteries and trying to fit round holes into square pegs, and so we had a lot of stuff we were doing feeding to Houston, and we became very involved. And I guess very quickly we all realized, we can save these guys.
What was the contribution of the KSC people?
We pretty much developed a procedure for charging the command module batteries from lunar module batteries. And we also worked along with Houston and Downey how to take that lithium hydroxide canister and make it fit to the lunar module.
Because the Apollo 13 film really leaves the impression that it was all done
Sure.
from Houston.
Yeah. It wasn't. It was, Downey was involved, Bethpage was involved, we were involved, some of the other subcontractors were involved. We were all feeding Houston. But that's okay. We just want to see them get back.
As you're getting back into the transfer from the LEM into the command module, you having such an association with the Grumman and LEM, what was your feelings at that moment in time regarding the LEM?
I always hated it that we had to lose them. I always wished there was some way to get them back. But very, very proud of the Grummans. You know, just really felt that these are just great guys. These are wonderful guys. This is a marvelous thing that they've done here. I felt close to Grumman too, right along in then. Felt really close to them.
As we're making our way into 1970, it's April 1970, right? We're starting to get cutbacks in relation to the federal government. Apollo 20 is canceled, and Apollo 18 and 19 will follow suit shortly thereafter. Starting to get a lot of layoffs. You being from the NASA, you're not really concerned about, I would think,
No.
job layoff. But you are seeing a lot of individuals.
Well, Grumman and Rockwell, they're gone after the final mission. You know, within a matter of weeks, people are gone. Within a matter of months, everybody's gone. Very few people stayed around. A lot of people stayed taking minor jobs just to wait for the next program. But it was a mass exodus after Apollo.
How does that impact you personally? What's your feelings towards it?
See, in 73, forget how that all, 73, one of the things that it really affected me is my first wife died in 73. And I was going with my new wife, who was her best friend in college. And the two families in the neighborhood that were very supportive of me and Barb moved. And had a lot of folks in the neighborhood that thought that was a terrible thing to do, bringing this hussy in from up north with 5 kids and not dating the widowers or the widows in the neighborhood, and I didn't wait long enough. And so the thing that affected me was I lost a couple of support group families that liked me, liked Barb, and all of a sudden they're gone. And that affected Barb more than me, because I was back at work. But here she is in a neighborhood that's hostile.
Did you have the hostility more from the people that were from NASA or from the locals themselves?
Neighbors. Didn't matter whether they were NASA or other contractors or what. It was the immediate neighborhood. Because they all loved Nita. You know, they put up with me just because I was her husband.
How many children did you have at the time?
I had 3, she had 5. That hussy from up north. That Yankee. But that was the main impact. The rest of it, you know, we were looking forward to getting on with Skylab and doing what had to be done with that.
Well, Apollo's 14, 15, 16, 17. 14 is known most for Alan Shepard. Any commentary on Alan Shepard?
Totally not what I expected. I expected somebody bigger than life, like Rocco. You know, his presence in the room was known the minute he walked in. Took charge of things, maybe a little aggressive, but it's almost like he wasn't there. Just very quiet, very cooperative. He and Ed Mitchell and just Ron Evans.
And I think
Just-
Evans was on 16.
Who was the command module pilot? Can't remember. But I remember Mitchell very much because several things. He tried the telepathy experiment from the moon. Never bothered to tell Shepard till after it was all over. It didn't work. But he was big into psychic healing. And he called me when I was in Houston with Nita at MD Anderson and asked how I felt about psychic healing. And I went over to his house he had a fellow named Norbu Chin who was doing psychic healing and tried with Nita. And, got to know a little bit more about Ed through that aspect of his life. And of course he started Noetic Science magazine out in California. And then, really enjoyed visiting with him again when I got his handprints last year, 2 years ago. But the big surprise was Shepard. He just smoothed right through. No problems. I expected something kind of like Wally, when Shiraz was being such a horse's ass in the chamber. I didn't expect him to be that bad, but I thought he would be more demanding. Just wasn't. Liked him.
The missions are starting to become more scientific as well as we're moving on. Apollo 17 is truly the most scientific of all the missions, and Harrison Schmitt. Any comments on that particular mission?
I knew Jack better than the others for some reason. Being lunar module pilot, I'm sure we spent more time with him. And I don't know, just didn't get to see Cernan a lot, just saw Jack a lot more than him. But it all became a blur after a while. You have 13 will stand out, Lim 11 will stand out, and the rest of it just kind of is there. And that's unfortunate, but it's the way it happens.
With 17, you know that this is the last one.
Yep.
At that moment in time, how long did you think? How long did you think it would take for us to get back to the moon? Knowing that.
I don't even remember having the thought. It just never occurred to me that we wouldn't. That we'll do Skylab, and here comes shuttle, and of course we had a big study that was done by Dr. Miller that we thought was our goals and our baseline for space exploration. And it had us going back to the moon. It had us with space stations around the lunar stations. It had us going to Mars. Had a heck of an aggressive planned program. It never happened. So, we just kind of said, well, we got this plan over here, so let's go ahead and take care of Skylab and shuttle and ASTP before that, so didn't give it a lot of thought other than to say, here it is. Naively assuming it would happen.
Looking back now at it, what do you think is the greatest legacy of Apollo?
It has to be the lunar exploration. What all we did from the standpoint of bringing back samples, being able to map out very precisely the lunar surface itself, especially where we had vehicles set down. But the legacy's not getting there. The legacy is what you did when you got there.
And looking back now after all the years, and it's been over 30 years, 31 years now since we've been there, what do you think has led to that lack of return and almost apathy amongst the people with the space program?
Loss of interest. I think it it's not so much the American people. The American people basically are going to follow what the government says we're going to go do. And the government's always saying, well, the American people. But, that's the government is really the American people, regardless of what people may think. Look at the war we're in now. If it were up to the American people, we wouldn't be there. But the government, the president, the movers and shakers in Congress and staff lost interest, lost sight of what they might have had even in the way of scientific goals on the moon and beyond. And their vision and their politics all of a sudden became very worldly, not outbound. And, look back at Kennedy going to the moon, a part of his politics was to distract from the Bay of Pigs. So, we got to do something here. We got to get people quit thinking about this because we're in jeopardy of losing the next election. Let's see what we can do to divert people. So a lot of it has to do with that kind of activity, that kind of goals, and where you want to be and who the hell it is. As if Kennedy hadn't needed the space program, I don't know that we'd have ever gone. But he needed something. And that happened to be knocking on the door.
As we draw to a close here, is there any areas that we haven't addressed that you'd like to address, or any commentary that you'd like to add?
Skylab. We spacecraft guys had our first meetings with the Marshall guys on Skylab. They were always there, but they were the launch vehicle guys and we were the spacecraft guys, and we knew some of the guys here at the Cape. We knew a lot of the launch vehicle guys because we lived in the same neighborhoods and we lived in the same buildings and we ate in the same cafeteria, so we knew the local launch vehicle guys, but we didn't know the guys out of Marshall. I know one or two of them because they'd be at flight readiness reviews and we might recognize them, but we never had a lot to interface with until Skylab. And then all of a sudden we met our brothers at Marshall. And they were a lot more like us than the JSC guys. And I think it's because of something you pointed out earlier, that a lot of the guys around here were all from the, this area of the country, these colleges, and Marshall the same way. JSC, different bunch of guys, different part of the country. But I think we just felt more at home with the guys out of Marshall. You call up there, how y'all doing today? We knew Georgia, Alabama won. So there was a whole Skylab experience in there with the Marshall folks that we really don't have time to talk about. But got to know some people there that those same guys out of Skylab now showed up in Shuttle. So we weren't brand new on Shuttle, forced together with some of the Marshall guys. We knew them from Skylab. And guys like George Hardy, guys I can't remember their names anymore, Dan Germany, who ended up at Houston doing, being a Apollo Shuttle program manager for a while, Shuttle. Didn't see a lot of the center director up there. He was kind of beyond his prime, Von Braun. I think the first time we ever started noticing him was he'd nod off in the meetings. He was getting old. He didn't wake up and he'd ask all the same questions we'd already talked about. And everybody go right back over them again like they'd never been talked about. But that was the thing of Skylab. It kind of brought us a lot closer to those guys. Made Shuttle a lot easier because we knew them. We sure butted some heads on the ATM, though.
Oh, telescope mount?
Mm-hmm. Had a lot of fun with the Marshall guys.
I remember reading some stuff when they brought the Hubble telescope mount over to Cecil to do some testing in there. They butt heads with JSC people too.
Well, the guy that headed that up was Gene Cagle. And Gene Cagle was a fireless son of a bitch. I mean, it was his. And nobody bothered with his hardware unless he said they could. But I liked Gene very much, liked him.
And they tried to bring in Marshall people to bring the ATM into Cecil Chamberay. That didn't go over too well with the Union folk over there. The riggers over there. That's just major problems.
Well, we butted some heads with him when he first showed up down here because we were the NASA guys that oversaw the contractors. He took his badge off and he says, "What the hell do you think this badge is?" NASA. So after we got over that initial conflict, we worked up some good teaming relationships with his NASA guys, our NASA guys, and contractors. They worked pretty well. We sent a bunch of guys to Marshall to help those guys up there. Then those same guys went to Houston, and the same guys came here. So by the time they got to Kennedy, they had formed a pretty good testing relationship.
And for you, the legacy of Skylab?
I think the big thing there was that we learned how to survive in space. We learned what you have to provide, what you have to do to keep yourself fit. And I think we learned that manned missions are going to have the advantage anytime because of the ingenuity that they can bring to the problems. And they bring hands, feet, eyes, and a head. If it's unmanned sitting out there, you don't have that. You know, you're very limited with the use of your ingenuity on the ground by having to do it all through telemetry and command systems. Would have certainly never saved Skylab. You'd have never gotten out there with an umbrella. We'd have never solved some of the problems we've had on other spacecraft. But Skylab really was, here's what you need to learn to live in space.
I'd like to thank you for participating. I know we're going to lose that audio over there in just about 2 seconds flat. But I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Good.